Hi, my name is Eduardo Ox. I'm the author of an MX package called EV, and the title of this video is org for non-users. Let me explain what I mean by this. To make a long story short, or actually to make two long stories short, in 2021 I finally understood why I have always found org mode so hard to learn. And it turns out that the documentation of org is written for users, and I realized that I'm a very bad user. I'm going to define this thing soon. I'm a non-user in a sense that I'm also going to define soon. I also found that I can use EV, my package, to write the documentation for org that I need. And the technique that I'm going to explain here may be useful to other non-users like me. I also found something that I found really weird. Let me explain. The main intent of EV is to let you take executable nodes of everything that you do. And taking executable nodes have one part that everyone understands, which is to save all commands that you send to external programs, usually REPLs. And it has a part that is much harder to learn, which is to save a Lisp hyperlinks to everything interesting that you find. And I discovered that this part is much harder than I thought. It was totally natural for me. When I started using MX, I started doing that immediately. But I discovered that most people can't even imagine how is the workflow of someone who works like this. And so I'm working on a way to make this easier to understand. I'm writing a tutorial about this. It's called Find Saving Links Intro. Let me show just the initial page of this tutorial. It starts with a section said reading diagrams aloud, but this is not important to us now. So now let me explain what are users and non-users. And let me use one feature of org mode called code blocks or source blocks as an example. If a user wants to learn how to use code blocks in org, then the user is probably going to need to learn what are the key sequences, what are the main examples or some examples, and a user does not want to see the source code. And a non-user is going to think in a way that is very different. A non-user needs to have a clear mental image of what is going on behind the scenes. So a non-user is going to ask questions like, how does org handle code blocks internally? What is the data structures that it uses? What is the source code like? What are the functions? How is it structured? And a non-user is also going to need repeatable tests that can be executed either unchanged or little changes to check what is going on. So let me start with the example. This thing here, no, let me use a smaller font here. This thing here is a source block containing shellcode. Actually, it contains lots of comments and just this line here of non-trivial shellcode. And we can run a code block by putting the cursor, the point, inside the code block and typing Ctrl+C, Ctrl+C. If I do that, what happens is that org creates a second block here called results, with the result of this command here formatted in a certain way as columns. Let me undo this. It turns out that typing Ctrl+C, Ctrl+C executes this function here. Org babel executes source block. So executing this text is equivalent to typing Ctrl+C, Ctrl+C. Undo again. And I can learn more about Ctrl+C, Ctrl+C in org mode by running this key sequence here, h-meta-k, which is a key sequence for help on keys on EV. And if I run this, I get this temporary buffer with lots of Elise Piper links. And in these nodes here, I've selected some of these Elise Piper links, and these two Elise Piper links, and I've just indented them a bit. So I took these two hyperlinks here, these two, and copied to my nodes and indented them. This one shows the description of this function, which is this. The description is quite long because the effects of this function depends on the context. One of these things here, the last one says, if the cursor is on a code block, evaluate it, and blah, 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 blah. I had to set this thing here to nil to make org stop asking me every time if I want to evaluate this thing or not. And org also has a key sequence for removing the results block. This key sequence is Ctrl+C, Ctrl+V, I can get a lot of help about, lots of Elise Piper links about this key sequence by running this exp here. And I've also selected these ones, these ones here, and copied them to the other buffer and indented them a bit. So this exp here shows the description of this function, and this exp here shows the source code of this function. It is here. So by executing this, I can see what are the name of the functions that do most of the work, because this function is quite simple. So it essentially calls other functions to do practically everything. And I also wanted to understand what are the data structures associated to a code block, because I knew that when org used the code block, it had to be done in two parts. One part was parsing the code block and representing it internally in a certain way that I imagined that would include information about this, information about the beginning and the end of the code block in this buffer, and so on. So I asked on IRC what is the function that does this parsing, and people pointed me to a function called org element context. And if I execute it here, I get a result that is too big. It doesn't fit very well in the echo area. So let me use one of my favorite pretty printing functions to take a look at this. It's not very pretty, so I can see that the important part is here, so I have to discard this initial part. If I take the cadre of the result of this, I get the part that is most interesting, this one here, and I can use this variant of my favorite pretty printing function to print it in a better way. So if I execute this, I can see the keywords and their values. And for example, suppose that I want to understand what are these numbers here. One thing that I can do is that I can, let me take the result of this and and put it in a variable called p. And p now holds a property list, and I can use listGet and listGet to get the value of the field begin, and this other listGet here to get the value of the field end. And I can use the function of EV that does these highlightings to highlight what is the region between between the value of the field begin and the value of the field end. And when I run this, I see something funny. This region includes these blank lines here. So I can use this thing here to understand the data structures and data structures, and I can find some non-trivial information here. I'm just going to show another thing that can be done with source blocks, and what I discovered about the source code, which is we can create a source block by hand by typing this begin thing and the end thing by hand, but there's a way to type that more quickly. It is described in this node of the org manual called structure templates, and it explains that if I type Ctrl+C, Ctrl, comma, and then one of these letters here, I get these blocks. So S is the one that I want, and if I type Ctrl+C, Ctrl, comma, there's some help here, so I can type S, and I get a source block. Here I can put Shell or Python or wherever, any supported language. And of course I want to know how this is implemented, how this can be extended to other languages and so on. So the first thing that I did was that I used my my key sequence for getting help on key sequences, which is h meta k. I used it to get help on Ctrl+C, Ctrl, comma. Let me try it here, meta h meta k, Ctrl+C, Ctrl, comma. I get this thing here, and I selected these two sexps and copied them to my notes. I got these ones here, and so this one points to this. The target of this sexp here is the description of this function, which is this thing here. Insert a block structure of the type blah, 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 begin full and end full, and then it says some more technical things here. And I can use this sexp here to go straight to its source code. I mean, I can use this and I can click on this button here, but I prefer to have a link that points straight to the source code, and it's this one. And so I can read these things here to understand what is going on, which variables it uses, and so on. And it turns out that this thing uses a variable called org structure template list, and if I can get help on this variable by typing meta h meta v. I get a buffer with the list hyperlinks like this, and what I did was that I generated a buffer like this and selected some of the most interesting hyperlinks and copied them to my notes here. So one of them is this find evar descriptor that opens the description of this variable. Just let me show that it appears here. It's a usually people would use describe variable, but when we execute it as a sexp, it returns a big return value here that messes up my screen. So I prefer to use this variant here. So yeah. With this, I can get a description of this variable that's a bit more technical than the description in the manual of org. And here it shows the current value of this variable. I can use, actually when I was looking at this, I discovered that there was something interesting here, and I could point to this something interesting by refining this hyperlink and making it search for this string in the description. So this link opens this description of the variable and searches for the first occurrence of the string src. And I can also run this sexp here to go to the place in the source code that in which this variable is defined. It's defined with the def custom. With here it's is initial value Here is its description, here is how it can be customized, and so on. And this is just a reminder that I can create source blocks by typing something like this. I think that I've used that before. If I type Ctrl+C, Ctrl+S, I get a source block that I can edit by hand. And this is an example of a source block created in that way with some non-trivial shell comments here inside. Yeah, that's it. That's what I wanted to show. Oh, no, just one thing more. By default, when I type meta-e on a SEXP, the meta-e opens the target of the SEXP in the same window. So if I execute this, I open the description of this function in the same window. But if I execute meta-e with a prefix 3, I mean, if I type meta3 meta-e or meta2 meta-e, I display the target in the right window. And this is practical because then I can show all these targets very quickly here. Yeah, so that's it. That's what I wanted to show in this video. Bye!